when do these decisions get made? So what is the timeline here, right? I mean, because and the league wanted this process drawn out more, and check that box. Mission accomplished there. Because Seattle hasn't just started interviewing people essentially this week, and then you keep mentioning that there are slips out for candidates. I mean, I know about the Rooney Rule, but everything else is still a bit murky for a lot of fans. What's the timing on all this?
We'll start with the Rooney Rule. The Chargers have fulfilled their obligations under the Rooney Rule. They're allowed now to make a hire. The Raiders have fulfilled their obligations. They can make a hire. The Falcons have not yet conducted an external interview with a minority candidate. You have to do 2 of those in person prior to making a hire. And then you referenced that pushing it back. January 22nd was the date that the league had established as the first time the current NFL assistants can do head coaching interviews. I would tell you, Rich, my personal concern, not speaking for the league, because obviously they put these policies in place for a reason. My personal concern, as soon as they pushed it back by another week, is the reality that if you understand how these things work and you understand how billionaire owners are geared, nobody was just going to sit there for 2 weeks, or in the case of, for instance, the Chargers or the Raiders or the Panthers who had made changes in the season. They're not going to sit on their hands until January 22nd and then go, okay, now let's run a real search. We've already got a pretty good idea in a lot of these places what direction this might head. There's a lot of back channeling that's involved in these things. Teams can be as ready as they want to be. Take the Washington Commanders GM search, in which they did 2 rounds of interviews in, I believe, a 3 or 4 day span, and then hired the guy, Adam Peters, that everybody in the league thought they were going to hire 2 months ago. You can approach this in different types of ways here. What you don't want to see is coaches, qualified men of color, having to go in already knowing that this may not be a real interview and that it's probably going to go a different direction. No matter what dates you set, no matter what policies you put in place, if you have mandates, you're setting yourself up where at times there are people who are going through the interview paces without necessarily having a true shot at the job. And that's not ideal. If the rules were different right now, you'd have, for instance, Raheem Morris, who's out of the playoffs, could be doing in-person interviews right now. Because of this mandate with January 22nd, he can't do those even though he's out of the playoffs until next week. They're going to continue to evaluate these policies. We'll see exactly how it plays out. I think it's fair to say from a league perspective, and listen, these owners can do whatever they want in the end, Rich. From a league perspective, the NFL would very much like teams to not finalize their hires until at least early next week and give some of these coaches an opportunity to interview in person, even though there's a lot of signs in certain places that maybe we're already headed a different direction.
So what are the Raiders? You mentioned the Raiders could go ahead and hire someone right now. What I mean, Max Crosby already came out and said, if it's no Antonio Pierce, we're going to have to start talking about maybe trading me. So what do you have for me about the Super Bowl hosts?
I would be extremely surprised, Rich, if Antonio Pierce is not the head coach, and if he is not the head coach prior to us all getting out there in a couple of weeks for Super Bowl week. Having said that, this is a really unique situation with Antonio Pierce, the rare interim coach who gave himself a chance to get the job, but also a guy who didn't have a ton of coaching experience. Yes, he'd been at Arizona State for several years and had a variety of different titles, not all of which were coaching, but he was a linebackers coach for a year and a half who now suddenly has given himself that opportunity to get the job. What you want to make sure, both from the Raiders' perspective and from Antonio Pierce's perspective, is that you're now giving him the best opportunity to succeed and enough resources and help to make that a success. So whether that involves the general manager hire, whether that involves who has personnel control within the organization, these are all part of the broader picture at a time that, remember, the Titans didn't interview with Antonio Pierce. If the Raiders don't hire him in the coming days, they could bring him in for an in-person interview. The Falcons also have an interview request out. If the Raiders don't get it done in the coming days, the Falcons could bring him in for an in-person interview. Again, I would be very surprised if Antonio Pierce doesn't ultimately end up being the Raiders head coach. But it's not as simple as, hey, we did 2 other interviews with Leslie Frazier and Chris Richard. We're ready to go. you're now the head coach. All signs are pointing in that direction, Rich, but there's some other things around him that need to be settled before they actually make that official and he signs on to be the Raiders head coach.
Catch the Rich Eisen Show every single day on the Roku channel, 12 to 3 Eastern, for free.